Hi, and welcome to this virtual edition of Con Edison's Family Science Night in the Green Belt. Today we are going to be talking about DNA and the cells that make up all of us. For today's activity, we will be making a model of an animal cell. There are different types of cells. All living things on the planet are made up of cells, but we are made up of animal cells, which is why I chose that one for today's activity. There are also plant cells, which are a little bit different. They have a very structured cell wall, and they also have something called chloroplasts, which make them green. So we definitely don't have those inside our body. And there's also bacteria cells, which are a little less sophisticated as our animal cells. But today, we're going to find out what all these parts are inside of our bodies by making a model of that cell. There are many different cells in each of our bodies. Some of those cells make up our skin, some make up our hair, some of them make up our muscles or our heart or our lungs or our liver, and all of them have specific jobs to do. So within each of these cells are smaller parts called organelles. Today when we do our model, we're going to talk about all different parts of the cell, and we're going to use candies or maybe some Play-Doh to represent those parts. There are many different ways you can make a model of a cell. It's really up to you and your imagination. Sometimes you can use a cookie and put candy and things like that on top of it and make it edible, or maybe even make a big pizza with different toppings that represent each organelle. For our activity today, I used gelatin and a bowl. I have some fruits, I have some Play-Doh, I have some spaghetti and other items that represent all of the organelles and the parts of the cell. But it's really up to you and your imagination. And once you understand what each organelle does and what it looks like, you can make your own project. The first part of the cell I want to talk about is the cell membrane. This is a really important part of the cell because it acts as a security system. Not only does it keep everything we need inside our cell in, it prevents other molecules from getting into it, maybe some toxins or something we don't want in our cells, and it allows the things that need to leave our cells, like waste, to leave the cell. So really important part of the cell. You may have seen a cell membrane if you've ever peeled an egg. So when you peel an egg, under the shell you might see that kind of rubbery, thin material. That's the cell membrane of the egg. So our cell membrane, which is my glass bowl here, is holding all of these organelles in place, but there's something else that's holding them in place, which is our cytoplasm. And our cytoplasm is the fluid which is inside the cell that keeps everything kind of in one space. It's sort of jelly-like, and for our model here, I used gelatin. So this is what I used. Look at this. This comes in smaller packets. You don't have to buy it in such bulk. And what I did was about 1 tablespoon of this to 2 cups of water. In my model, I used about 4 cups of water. So 2 tablespoons of gelatin to 4 cups of water. And all you have to do is boil the water, dissolve the gelatin. And before you start making your model, you're going to let that harden a little bit, just like you would with Jell-O. If anybody's ever eaten Jell-O, it's the same thing without the flavor and the color. So this works really nicely because it's very similar to maybe the consistency of what would really be inside an animal cell. So now we're going to talk about the organelles that are in our cell. So one of our main and most important ones is the nucleus. The nucleus is pretty much the control center of the cell, or the brain of the cell, and it contains DNA, which contains the instructions for everything that happens inside the cell. So inside the nucleus is a smaller organelle called the nucleolus, and that sits inside the cell. You can kind of see it here. I used a lime and a gumball. And what the nucleolus does, it actually manufactures something called ribosomes, and we're going to talk about those in a few minutes. But what I did here was just cut the lime in this case, or you can use a little tangerine or a lemon or any other kind of fruit that you want. Ones that already have a pit in it, like a peach, would work wonderfully because that would already have your nucleolus inside. But what I did was cut it in half, and I dug out a little bit and stuck the nucleolus inside, and then placed it right in the middle of my cell. So again, use your imagination. It's your creation, so do whatever you like. So the next organelle we are going to talk about is the mitochondria. I'm using jelly beans for this activity, but you can use Mike and Ike's, or if you don't want to use candy, you can use raisins. They make a really good mitochondria. And the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. So inside here, energy is being created, and that energy is getting spread out throughout the cell, and that's what helps you live, breathe, move your muscles, and everything else that happens inside your body. So really important is the mitochondria, and you're going to have more than one inside your cell, so you can throw a couple of those in there. So now we're going to talk about the ribosomes, and if you remember, they are made in the nucleolus, which sits inside the nucleus. What happens with the ribosomes, and for this activity we are using some little sprinkles because they are quite tiny. What they do is they take the information from the DNA in the nucleus and they make it into proteins. So think of it sort of like if you had a recipe for cake. You would take the cake recipe, which is your information, find all the parts you need, the eggs, the sugar, the flour, and make a protein out of it. So that's sort of what they're doing. Instead of making a cake, it's making proteins. And again, those proteins are what build our skin and our eyes and our hair and everything else in our body. So really important job that they have to do. Another really important part of our cell is the endoplasmic reticulum. So you can see here, I made it out of Play-Doh, but you can use licorice, any kind of squiggly thing that you can find. And it's also really important for building those proteins that we were talking about. And as you can see in some of this endoplasmic reticulum, we do have ribosomes. So they sit inside parts of the ER, we can call it. And there's two different types of ER. There's the rough ER, which have the ribosomes, and the smooth ER, which does not contain ribosomes. But these, again, all play a part with the ribosomes in creating proteins for your cells. So our next part is one of my favorites. It's called the Golgi body or the Golgi Apparatus. And this is a really interesting part of the cell because it takes all those proteins, packages them up, and then sends them out into your body or wherever they are needed. So I think of this kind of like the Amazon warehouse of the cell. So how it works is you have your nucleus, and then your protein building, and then your protein packaging. So they all kind of sit in the same area of the cell and work together to get those proteins where they need to be. Our gummy bears are going to represent vacuoles. Now vacuoles, after all these proteins and different materials are ready to leave the cell, they kind of package up into this and move out of the cell. Vacuoles in a plant cell actually have a really important job, and they're much bigger than in an animal cell. And what they do is hold a lot of water, and they help to actually keep the structure of the plant upright. So you'll notice sometimes if your plant doesn't have enough water, it starts to wilt. That's because these are getting smaller and smaller and don't have enough water pressure to keep the plant upright. So really important part of the cell. It's very important in a plant cell, but we have them in our cells as well. And those are called vacuoles. Our cells undergo a process called cell division, and that's what happens when our body is making new cells. So we are getting new skin cells, new hair cells, all sorts of cells growing and dividing all the time. And one important part of that process is something called a centriole. And right here we have a cut up Twizzler bite representing that. It looks very much like the actual structure of a centriole. And again, that's really important in the process of meiosis and mitosis, which are both cellular division processes. There are lots of parts to a cell, but for today, the last one we're going to talk about are the lysosomes and peroxisomes. And what I'm using here is mini starbursts cut up into quarters. They're fairly small, and what they do is they get rid of toxins in the cell and any waste and get rid of it, and they also act as recycling centers. So any of the other organelles that have maybe died or not useful anymore or not functioning properly, they'll break them down into their smaller parts and use those parts to create new proteins. So they're taking the old parts, breaking them down, and bringing them to the ribosomes to make new proteins. So they are like a recycling center, but they're also a waste center. They're getting rid of all the bad stuff, anything you can't use, and taking it out of the cell as waste. So really important part of the cell. Without them, there'd be a lot of things building up in our cells, and we wouldn't want that. Thanks for joining us for this virtual edition of Con Edison's Family Science Night here at the Greenbelt. If you'd like to follow the Greenbelt's virtual programming, you can go to our website at sigreenbelt.org or follow us on social media and YouTube.